Hi, everybody. Welcome to Dan on Sports. A couple of interesting stories making news as we put this podcast episode together. The first one involves the chairman of ESPN, Jimmy Pitaro. This is a fascinating story, and it's a story that I have talked about for a while, and it has to do with our younger generation, whatever letter the younger generation is now called. But ESPN had a big get-together at its headquarters in Bristol the other day, and it was a news conference. I think it was to promote its upcoming NBA coverage, whatever, although the NBA season is underway. But nevertheless, they had this big get-together, and at the news conference, Pitaro, the head of ESPN, was asked what keeps him up at nights. And he said, I'll tell you what keeps me up at night. What keeps me up is the fact younger kids are not watching sports. They're not watching sports on television. They're not streaming sports as much. That's what keeps me up at night. Now, you've got to understand a couple of things here. When you're in the position of a Jimmy Pitaro, and pick your sports network, just not ESPN, but pick your sports, pick your news network. When you are in that kind of a business, you're always looking ahead. You're looking 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. What's it going to be like? And if you are investing not millions, but billions in your infrastructure so that you can continue to offer a viable product, and all of a sudden you see that your viewer base is dwindling away, well, naturally that's going to keep Jimmy Pitaro up at night. I would imagine it would keep anybody who's in that kind of a position up at night, because that's your job. Your job is not only to produce a profitable product as of the moment. Your job is to produce a profitable product 2 years down the road, 3 years down the road, and then look 10 years down the road at what it's going to be like. That's that business. And if younger kids are not watching sports now, then I can tell you we have them in our family, teenagers who could care less about sports. If they're not watching sports, well, down the road, there are going to be major problems, particularly when these broadcast entities have spent not millions, but billions of dollars for broadcast rights. Pick your sport, particularly when you're talking about the recent deals negotiated with the National Football League and the NBA. So this is a big, big issue, and that's what keeps Jimmy Pitaro up at night. And if you think, well, that's 10 years down the road, that's such a long way. Is it? Is it really that far down the road? 15 years ago, Anthony Volpe, in 2009, the last time the New York Yankees won a World Series, had his picture taken with his idol, Derek Jeter. 15 years ago seems like the snap of a finger, because there was the picture the other night. Volpe getting interviewed by his hero, Derek Jeter, now broadcasting for Fox as he hit a grand slam to lead the Yankees to a Game 4 victory. So 15 years goes by like nothing. And when you're in the position of a Jimmy Pitaro, or pick your leader of a sports or news network, you got to start thinking about these things. And so that's what keeps him up at night. Keep this in mind. The number one product on television, number one, whether you're talking news, sports, whatever, the number one product on television, that's linear television, is the National Football League. The average age of those who watch an NFL game, are you ready for this? 62 and a half years. I mean, if you're an executive, that boggles your mind. 62.5 years. That is the average age of your typical viewer of an NFL game. So you can understand why people are concerned who are executives in that business. Now, why has the NFL migrated to Amazon for Thursday Night Football? And why did the NBA just cut a deal with Amazon for basketball to be streamed? Well, the average age drops to 47 and a half years for those who watch the Thursday night NFL game on Amazon. So streaming is still a big deal, but even that is not attracting the demographic that advertisers want and sports executives want. They want that age to drop even more because that's the future. And they are just concerned that down the road, the billions that they poured into their infrastructure is going to be wasted. So it's very fascinating to see how the suits are talking about all of this in regards to the future of sports, the future of sports on television. Now, as the story, and all of this, by the way, was in Front Office Sports. I will link to the story in the show notes. What is also interesting is it's not as if all these kids are not watching sports. Many of them are not, but those who are following sports in the younger demo are consuming it in other ways. In other words, as the story points out, they are not sitting down in front of their TV sets or even in front of their streaming device and spending 3 hours watching a game. Whether you're talking about a football game, a basketball game, and basketball games these days seem to be going 3 hours if you're watching the NBA, or the NFL, which a typical NFL game is lasting over 3 hours. And we know how long a baseball game can be. So they are not sitting down like you might have done or I might have done. And even I don't sit down for a lot of these games in front of the TV set for 3 hours or with my tablet watching games. That's a long time. And the younger demo is not doing it. Now, that doesn't mean they're not following sports. Some of them are. How are they doing it? Social media, or you pick your device. But the other concern, getting back to what Pitaro said, is to the demo who is young and is not watching sports at all. What are they doing? Well, again, social media, Netflix, all this other stuff. That's why you see that they are concerned, because they've got billions of dollars tied up. It's all changing. As I write about occasionally in the Dan on Sports newsletter, it's changing before our very eyes. In fact, and I'll link to this story in the show notes, a couple of weeks ago, in one of my Dan on Sports newsletters, I wrote how newspapers are dead. Nobody reads the newspaper anymore, and I put nobody in quotes. Very few people read a hard copy of the newspaper anymore. They might go online and read the paper, although, again, if you go online, well, that entity, that newspaper entity, its online website is being challenged by a myriad other websites. So they're not in competition with just the very few entities that still print a newspaper. They're in competition with all these other websites. And I wrote in my newsletter a couple of weeks ago, and you can look it up, I wrote how newspapers essentially are dead, and that you're going to see, because layoffs have been just amazing in the industry year after year, more people are getting laid off. And I wrote, you're going to see even more and more newspapers cease printing a hard copy, that printed edition. You'll be able to get it online, or maybe they print once a week. Well, wouldn't you know, and I'll link to this story in the show notes, it was announced that the Newark Star-Ledger is going to do away with its print edition. And you're going to see more and more do this. We're in the fourth quarter now. The third quarter numbers have come in for these publishing entities, and they're bleeding money. They're bleeding red. It's a dying industry. And so what are they doing now? As I predicted, and it's not just me, others have predicted, if they want to stay in business, they're going to have to lay off even more people and essentially cease their print operations or print once a week. And the other thing they're going to do, it's going to be cheaper for them to mail out that print copy rather than have it being delivered. Because you can't afford the cost of having the trucks deliver the bundles of papers to carriers. It's just astounding, all that is unfolding before our very eyes in an industry that is changing. As always, thanks for subscribing to the podcast. And by the way, Substack, where this podcast is located, in addition to my Dan on Sports newsletter, entities like Substack are the ones which are thriving and helping to change the landscape. The landscape not is changing, the landscape has changed. And whether it's talking about a younger demo not watching sports, and many of that younger demo not even following sports, or a younger demo that only follows sports by way of social media, or, an occasional look at Amazon Prime, it's all changing. It is all changing before our very eyes. So, again, thank you for subscribing to the podcast. Thank you for subscribing to the newsletter. And again, you can do so by going to my website, sportscasterdan.com or danlavallo.com to subscribe and not only get my Dan on Sports newsletter, but also the Dan on Sports podcast. And again, to paid subscribers, you're going to get some additional content that's not available to those who choose to subscribe on a free basis. But whatever, thank you for subscribing and thank you for following Dan on Sports.